In this webinar, we will talk about science and art practices. The presenters will discuss what science art is and how we approach our different collaborations with artists and scientists. I will present Andrea. She's a filmmaker and an interdisciplinary researcher in science art, an expert in nano art forms that engage with nanoscience and nanotechnology. She creates experimental films and moving image installations that explore scale, technological mediation, and the multisensory perceptions of submolecular realm. Joanna is an artist, scientist, and faculty member at the University of Hawaii. While formally trained in entomology, research, and studio art, she has actively pursued cross-disciplinary collaborations, exploring the wonders of the natural world. Her program aims to explore the conceptual realm where art, science, and innovation reside. I really hope after this Science Cafe, you open your possibilities as a scientist and as an artist. So I will stop talking now, and I will let our presenters to start talking. So let's begin.
Hello, thank you for that, Anna Karen. Hi, Joanna.
Hi, thank you. Thank you guys both. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me. So today, Andrea and I want to discuss our approaches and our background in art science or science art. And we decided to do a little interview where we're going to ask each other questions. And then if you have any questions for us, you can put them in the Q&A. So I'm going to start, Andrea. So my first question to you is, what is art science research?
So that is quite a long question. We could probably spend an entire session discussing on its own. But I think really generally, science art or art science research is where there's an engagement, an interdisciplinary engagement between two different fields. So it might be, in my case, nanoscience and filmmaking. It might be drawing and anatomy. But the real crux of it is that artists are engaging with the data, instrumentation, and philosophies of science. Do you have anything to expand on that, Joanna?
Not much, just maybe what I found is that those possibilities that Andrea was saying are endless, those ways that you can interact and fuse them together. And that's been part of the wonder and the joy that I've experienced with art and science, is learning how other people are putting these subjects or fields together and growing and learning from that. So yeah, there's multiple different ways.
So what kinds of science art collaborations have you been involved with in your work?
So I've been involved with many different types. I guess my most current collaboration now is the research programs I've been starting to build. So I work at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and I work with the ornamental industry. So that is the growers that grow beautiful flowers like this anthurium, orchids, other tropical flowers like hibiscus. And the beautiful part about this is that when we develop a breeding program, for example, we're not just trying to find traits that are insect resistant or disease resistant. So we also care about these aesthetic traits and design principles. And it's a collaboration with designers and marketers and communication majors and scientists, geneticists, soil scientists, entomologists, such as myself, which is insects. So that's one example of how we all come together. And it's very interesting because artists sometimes have very different approaches than scientists. So when you get all of these people in a room together, there's a lot of learning to be had and a lot of discussion. And I think that's an important part, taking the time to value that and really share those different perspectives that we all bring to the table. So that's one example. What about you, Andrea? What are some art science projects you've been working on?
So my background was first in biomedical science. I worked as a scientist first before returning to study film, and then doing a master's and a PhD in creative practice-based research that integrated science and film. And often a lot of people would say to me, those are really different, but actually I was shifting from a scientific practice that was very heavy on microscopy. I was doing a lot of work with different high-end microscopic approaches, and then once I got into film, I was working in camera. So it was both of these processes are really optical and interested in how to capture the world visually. So in terms of the collaborations that I've been working on, more recently, I've been focusing my work in nano art and working with nanoscientists. So for people who aren't familiar with nanoscience, it's not really one discipline, but it's a scale. So we're talking about from 0.1 to 100 nanometers. Scientists who work at that scale, and that might be a chemist, a biologist, people in medical science, materials scientists, physicists, and all of that sort of thing. And if you think about the scale they're working on, a human hair is approximately 50 to 80,000 nanometers in diameter. So we're talking about very, very small development of materials and technologies. So I've been really interested in how optics sort of fail us at those scales. So we have less ability to capture images, capture real-time images at these very small scales. So initially when I got interested in working with nanoscientists, I was thinking, how does a filmmaker work at this scale? What do we do? How do we create real-time images of these phenomena that are whizzing around at this scale? So initially my first collaboration was with a group in Melbourne, Australia, called the Micro Nano Research Facility. So this was a really large facility where lots of different disciplines came together, and I ended up working with a group of materials scientists who were looking at characterizing different materials that could be used in microelectronics. And then more recently, I've been working with a group who do nanobiosensing work. So these are chemists who generate nanoparticles and systems to help either aggregate toxins in the environment or connect to biomarkers in the blood and to understand how they can create these systems that are basically really rapid biodiagnostic systems. Those were the technologies that I got interested in when I was working with them.
Thanks. Do you have more? I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I just wanted to ask if, in your experience, have you felt like it's necessary with science art projects to be working in the laboratory, or is that just one option?
I think for me, it's not always necessary. It is one option. I was trained as an artist first, and then I kind of turned scientist, and I tend to use the art principles and philosophies that I was taught and apply them towards the scientific method. And sometimes I struggle to kind of fuse these two subjects seamlessly. Sometimes it feels like I'm utilizing art in my science or utilizing science and technology in my art. And that's kind of my constant journey and the thing that's always keeping me interested in this art science field. And so I think that the laboratory, it just depends, and it depends on what my collaborators are or who they are. So sometimes yes, other times no. But what I love about what I'm doing now is I kind of get a bit of everything. I get to be in the field, the laboratory, and then the studio. Right now it's design is through online, given the current pandemic. But yeah, sometimes there's studio and art students involved. So how about you? Oh.
Thinking the other day about how often art and science hybrid projects are carried out within a laboratory, or the laboratory becomes the main sort of center for this kind of production of knowledge. And I was wondering if you know of any examples where scientists have shifted into an artist's studio, because I think that's one thing that is always a bit of a struggle, is that, you know, inviting the scientists, come out of the lab, come and see what I'm doing over here in my studio. So often I find myself in the lab because it's easier to do that than to extract the scientists from the laboratory. What's your experience of that?
So I have a couple. One is through teaching. So I taught a lot of art science And that was where we really got undergraduates who were pursuing their bachelor's or graduate students pursuing their master's and PhD out of the laboratory and into the studio. And it was a very interesting process. I've also seen artists get their master's or PhDs in science. And when I look at that kind of comparison, I oftentimes see that scientists tend to be more structured. There's a list of procedures they need to follow. We're bound by the scientific method. Where artists, when they go into the lab, they're kind of like, why not? Why this? They're asking a lot of questions that maybe scientists took for granted just because they learned it, absorbed it, and have done it that way. And it's really interesting because when I saw scientists, especially young scientists getting their bachelor's in the art studio, they have a struggle a little bit to change that mindset, to be able to do whatever they want, to be able to have such freedom and really trust themselves to be able to do that project. But within a couple weeks, they do an amazing job, and I think they surprise themselves. So I always love seeing that journey. And the only experience I've seen where a scientist has really gone out into the art studio for research was when they created art that they used in their research. So if they were testing fake flowers versus real flowers for a choice test for insects, and they made the flowers themselves instead of buying synthetic ones, or something similar, using paintings of pictures of food versus the actual food, which also has olfactory system, like senses for those insects, and see, do they use sight or is it a combination? Which one's more dominant for them to find their food? So things like that I've seen.
Your comment around intuition, I think, is really interesting, and that's a really valuable tool that as artists we rely upon in our research. And it's much more acceptable within artistic academia to say, I felt something. You would never write that in a scientific paper. But I think there's still, even though it's not an accepted or commonly documented way of progressing in science, I think there's a lot that science can gain from intuition. If we look at, for example, Andre Geim, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering graphene, in his Nobel Prize speech, he spoke about his Friday night experiments, which was when he'd ticked off all the boxes, he'd followed the procedures for the week as a scientist, and he allowed himself to go back into the laboratory and play. He also famously said that in every discarded scientific sample, there's a paper. And so these were times when he would go and just make combinations of random samples with random techniques. And this is something that I think is getting a little bit lost in today's really rapid publish or perish scientific academic situation. And I think it's something that as artists, when we go into laboratories, when we interact with scientists, we can really help to improve how people think about their own intuition and their own play, and think of those as valid research techniques again.
I agree. And I think that's one of the great things about, art science is when I didn't see, people think of them as such opposites perhaps, but I just saw a lot of experimentation and play. And I do think that it's a very important part in because I think we're all naturally curious and creative. We're all naturally scientists and artists together. And these two traits really do complement each other. It's just valuing them and honoring them and fostering your own creativity and curiosity and how those two things manifest in your life. And so I would tend to agree with you. And as a scientist and faculty member at a university, and I'm new to this university, it can be hard to sometimes talk about my intuition as if it might feel like I'm discredited if I say things that aren't just fact-based, but just a thought or an intuition or a feeling. So it is hard to kind of juggle that. And again, it's just using my own intuition and how to phrase what I'm trying to say. Compassion, or truth with compassion, I guess. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, Andrea.
So this maybe leads on to another thought and question, and that's, how important is it, in your opinion, with science art collaborations for the scientist involved and the artist involved to have common goals or strategies for the research?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So, does there need to be common goals shared? I've had collaborations where maybe there was an overarching common goal, but there was plenty of smaller goals or objectives that were not shared. And I usually try to take an underdeveloped idea and bring it to my collaborators and get their feedback prior to having it super developed, because that's where I get the most synergy, I would say, in my projects. I love collaboration and I love cross-disciplinary collaboration, because what it truly does for me, and it's almost your own personal path, how you and your collaborators come together to create something. But it is always a level of opening my mind. It breeds understanding and compassion for each other. And I've learned new approaches, new methodologies, new perspectives, and I take those perspectives with every new project I then do. So I think it might seem like it's necessary more than it's actually necessary. And it's just being willing to discuss, because we're making sure that we're understanding what the other person's saying, and taking that time to really value and foster that kind of environment prior to just jumping in and start doing a project.
Yeah, I find it's difficult for the arts anyway, regardless of whether they are a researcher working with scientists or not, to come in and make claims for what you plan to achieve. And the way that I sort of think about it is that science has a very specific hypothesis and it narrows down toward that hypothesis. Arts is almost the opposite. It might start with an area, like for example, my work investigating the ethics of nanobiosensing technologies starts from a point, but actually what it does is opens up questions. So it's really always a challenge to find where those two methodologies kind of intersect with one another. And it can be frustrating for scientists as well, I think, to understand where the artist is coming from. If they're just asking a broad question like, how does a filmmaker work in a scale where there are no optical technologies?
I agree. And from personal experience, I would agree too. I mean, science teaches you, when you're writing your grant proposal or a proposal for a project, you have to have a clear set of questions and hypotheses, and those are your objectives. And so, and then the nice thing is I was trained in art first, and I loved that I could just put pen to paper and see where it took me and not really know. So it's always been hard for me to also, and I'll find that I even have difficulty if I'm in a certain state of mind working with a scientist to then switch. And it's a really great practice to be able to practice when you're in a big collaboration project like that. But I do think that there's this way to do it in science where you can combine, and that's really been my struggle, is combining these two processes. And sometimes I love how these processes, at least in art, can sometimes become the project itself. Sometimes that process is more interesting than the final project, and we end up highlighting that. And in science, we do know that when we find the answer to one question, we usually have more questions. And I found, this is maybe a little tangentially related to that question, but that finding interesting ways to disseminate that science instead of just peer-reviewed journals, or in addition to those peer-reviewed journals, can more easily highlight that process, if that's something you do want to highlight, because I know the materials and methods of papers can be pretty dry. So whether that's through infographics or video, I think that's been a successful way that I've done it. Do you have any experience disseminating your projects in unconventional ways, I guess?
Yeah, quite a few. So because my research has pretty much always been practice-led research, which is where the knowledge creation comes out of the process of making the art. It's slightly distinct from practice-based research. And I'm not sure if you use the terms differently in the States, but this is how we sort of think of them in Australia. So practice-led research is slightly different from practice-based research, which is more about you create maybe it's a sculpture and you finish it and you reflect on that piece of work that's practice-based, whereas practice-led focuses on the processes. And particularly when working with scientists, that's been really fruitful for me because I've created new modes of making the moving image. And coming back to that last point on different approaches or common approaches or not, I've been very lucky to work with scientists who have been quite open-minded and who have allowed me to enter their spaces and given me resources and worked with me and taught me without requiring really goals that are in line with theirs. But what has happened in one particular project was there was a kind of like chiasma in terms of the importance of the work. So at the beginning, we sort of started here, where the scientists were saying, we're interested in seeing what this person comes up with without having a strict hypothesis. And I was really interested in just playing and seeing what creative opportunities were in a nanoscience laboratory for me. And after a year, there was a point where I'd been noodling away with all the instrumentation, and I developed a process of creating the moving image, which then became of interest to them. So we met in the middle. And from that point, I took the process and I made art and ended up over here. They took the process and used it to understand or characterize some of the materials in a way that they weren't able to do with still images. So they ended up over here. So we kind of went through, even though we at no point sat down and said, let's aim to do this using the tools of art and science, we still had these outcomes that were the same technique, but there were different outcomes for both fields, which was really interesting.
I love that. Can I ask, how did you get into the art science field?
So I first studied biology and worked in biological research for a few years. I actually was, when I was studying biology, my undergrad, I was working in film as my part-time job in costume, actually. And so I was already interested in cinema. And basically, I started working as a scientist. I hadn't yet done a PhD because I wasn't sure I wanted to dedicate my entire life to one molecule. And then I started working as a scientist and studying film. So again, I had this duality, but they weren't really fusing at that point. It wasn't until I had worked for a few years and traveled overseas and sort of thought about what I wanted to do that I realized I could integrate these two. So this was around 2006 when bioart was becoming really, really famous. I still think that that's been sort of the longest standing kind of integration between a science field and an art field. So I was aware of that. And when I came back to Australia after traveling around for a while, I decided to do a master's in creative practice-based research. I was still studying film though, but working as a scientist. So I was working in visual neuroscience and studying film. And then my PhD was really the first time where I was determined to enmesh these two different fields into one project. So yeah, basically I've been interested in it for a long time and have, yeah, really only the last sort of 7 years have managed to merge them together. But I think there are possibilities out there now for people. Like, for example, there are masters of biological arts at Symbiotica in Western Australia. There are a lot of courses in Europe. There are quite a few in the States too, right?
There's some, I know of more of undergraduate programs that focus on art science or highlight art science. I'm not so familiar with upper level degrees that are the focus, but there could be.
So I wanted to pick up also on, you mentioned the importance of understanding one another in art science collaborations. And I just wondered what obviously a lot of people talk about the language, the different ways that we speak about reality within science and artistic fields. What's your sort of, what else is there that we need to understand about each other's practices to have good collaborations?
So I think for me, in my experience, I've experienced where we think that we're starting with an objective, maybe it's an objective-based approach. And each person might come with these preconceived ideas or assumptions, where other people might come thinking, we haven't yet decided on the approach. And so, especially the larger the collaboration, the more people involved, the more patience is needed. Not just understanding, but I think understanding and patience go hand in hand. And I think for a lot of scientists, especially, you had talked a lot about that play aspect and allowing yourself time to play and valuing that and what that's doing for your creativity and developing that part of you, and for your curiosity and developing that part of your brain, and also for your intuition. And it also involves trusting yourself, right? That something's gonna come out of this if that's the goal, or if you got a grant to do it. And even if what's coming out of it is learning, which is oftentimes the thing that I value the most. And that's why I think a lot of people go into science or research, because they're constantly learning about the world. Same with art, in a very different way. So I think all of these different traits come in, and I constantly find myself having to be aware of what's going on in my head and the judgments going on in my head when I'm doing that. And these types of collaborations really force me to. So when I'm working just with scientists, we're usually like-minded, my mind's in that headspace, and we're just going and doing our thing, and I'm not having to go out of the box or out of the ordinary. So I've seen times where people get frustrated and things maybe aren't moving at the timeline they had in their head or thought it would move. And I think sometimes in the science community, we don't always value this communication aspect. Currently in my department, I'm trying to start a mindfulness moments and also lunches, because we can't physically be with each other. So maybe we can talk over lunch, because sometimes the best ideas come from when you're just out with your friends talking, or out with other colleagues talking, or with citizens. And so I think valuing that kind of communication is important. And I've had a lot of pushback. So I haven't gotten a lot of buy-in, but since I value it, I'm going to keep trying, chugging along. But I do think it requires a certain amount of patience. And if you're willing, I think that's really all you need, because you can be patient with yourself. It's fine to get frustrated or impatient and things like that. But if you come willing, I think that's the key component. Have you found any similar experiences or?
Well, I think that you're right in that communication is something that scientists often value in artists. They do recognize that we provide not just intellectual engagement with their work, but also emotional engagement with their work. I'm thinking of a couple of experiences where I was really misunderstood. Well, looking back, I've reflected on it and decided I need to be better at articulating what it is that I do and what it is I bring to a collaboration. But at the time I was kind of like, when I was introduced to a lab group as a new artist in lab, and the director said, "This is Andrea, she's going to help us make our data look pretty." And I was like, oh, they don't understand that I'm a filmmaker and a media artist, that I'm not a visual artist, that I don't draw, that I, or not to the level that I think they were expecting. So that was a really telling experience for me. And the second one was when a very, very intelligent scientist told me right at the beginning of our collaboration, I don't understand the difference between art and design. And to me, I was like, wow, okay, that's amazing. But this is sometimes when you focus so much in a scientific discipline, present company excluded, of course, because you have dual educations, but we can't assume that scientists understand what it is we do, even as practitioners, let alone as researchers. And there are so many different ways that you can go about artistic research. So I think a friend of mine who's an artist turned designer who works with scientists, she designs medical instruments that are beautiful and so hopefully more usable by ill people. And she has this term which comes from, it's pretty management speak, so I don't love it, but she talks about capability mapping. And so sitting down at the beginning of a collaboration and saying, this is what I do, and showing people what you do. And I think that's valuable in both directions. So I can sit down and say, I've made documentaries, I have interviewing skills, I have camera skills, I have microscopy skills, I do this and that, and maybe even I don't do these other things. And this is valuable in both directions. I've also had the experience where I've been working in a lab and I had this idea that I want to make something using scientific technologies. And I've been put in touch with someone, perhaps a postdoctoral fellow, I think it was. So someone, you know, a slightly more junior scientist, and that person's gone, yeah, let's try. And we get down the track a few months. And then it comes out, they're not actually an expert in making, in this case, it was micro-engineered flexible electronics. It turns out that's not actually the area of expertise. And we probably could have cut it off much sooner, knowing that it wouldn't have worked if I had known that that wasn't his area of expertise, that he was doing something else. But so it goes in both ways. Like, I don't always have a great understanding of what a materials scientist does. That's a pretty big field in itself. So I think this idea of capability mapping is something that I'd like to adopt for my own work, to actually spend more time and energy in a more structured way at the outset of a collaboration, to understand what the skills are, where the gaps might be for the project, do we need to bring other people in, and that sort of approach.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I've never heard of capability mapping before, but I do. I haven't had the same experience, but I have had experiences where people discuss what they're interested in instead of their capabilities. And I guess it goes hand in hand, because you got to know what are the capabilities and what are the interests, and how can we foster everyone's interests by using our strengths. So yeah, that's great.
Do you have any more?
I do. I think we might have touched on it a little bit, but what do you think the benefits of art science or science art or cross-disciplinary collaboration really are?
I've been writing funding applications this week, so I'm going to start with the kind of thing that I say in funding applications, is that creative practices can help scientists with communication, with public engagement. But more broadly than that, I think it comes back to what we were talking about in terms of embracing a broader kind of skill set in terms of your knowledge building as a scientist. I think as artists, I like to think that when I work with scientists, I give them a better appreciation of play, of serendipity, of intuition. And I think also that frees them up to go away and look at their workload, because I think that these huge workloads are actually detrimental to scientific innovation. If you don't have time to go away and play a sport or do yoga or be in your body, that's one sort of thread of knowledge that you're cutting off that may or may not contribute to innovation, or playing games with your friends, or just using your brain in a completely different way. So I think that that's something that, as artists who use those kinds of methods a little more regularly, we're almost modeling that kind of innovation, that, you know, bringing together this and that, and putting these different things together and creating new ideas. There's that, I can't remember the name of the scientist, but Rogelio probably knows, he was a molecular biologist who was really into origami. And then he ended up creating this protein folding technique that came from the art of origami, something that the idea would never have occurred to him if he hadn't had this other practice or this other interest in his life. And so I think it's a really difficult thing to model, but I think that is one of the most powerful things that artists bring to science.
I agree. And I'd like to second that sentiment, because I think for me, the benefit was I always became very fascinated, as you had mentioned, innovation, and then the process of innovation. And what does that look like? What state of mind are you in when you have these ideas that end up being something you really enjoy or lead to something that you think is a big contribution to the world? And how do we get in that state of mind and things like that? And I tend to agree that we forget that we need to slow and foster our creativity and be inside our bodies and really try a bunch of different activities to find what works for us. And in this world of producing and consuming, and especially information can quickly become the most important thing. But whenever I'm collaborating across disciplines, namely art and science, I'm always reminded of this broader perspective. So it always tends to broaden my perspective. And I'm grateful for that. So yeah, I would agree with you. So should we answer some questions that people have?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So let's address this first one. What is better to study first, art or science? A disclaimer that we have the opposite in our careers. I studied science first and then moved on to art.
And I started with art and moved on to science. Do you want to answer first?
Gosh, I don't know. Look, I think it's more common to move from science to art. I think that you're actually one of the very few people that I know who's moved in the other direction. So whether that's better or not, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I actually know more people that moved, maybe because I moved from art to science, so maybe that's why, in that direction. And I don't think one is better than the other. I think it's really asking yourself what feels best. And if it's, I really know a lot about this, about science, and I want to do that first and then go into art, or I know a lot about science and I want to do something else first and then go back. And I think that's completely, either is fine and valid and goes towards a similar goal.
One thing I will say about studying science first is that, and I really believe that undergraduate degrees are, 10 years down the track, you're probably not going to remember all of the context or the content of those years of study, but you are going to still have these remnants of a mode of thinking. And it was very hard for me to, shifting into artistic research, it was very hard for me to let go of some of the more analytical and structured ways of thinking about my work and about the world. I had to really actively work on that, and also how to write. It took me a long time to stop writing in the passive voice. I still catch myself doing it sometimes. So that training is a lot more rigorous and strict in science. I don't know if someone would have the same problem going back the other way, or if that is actually an easier or more fluid transition. Did you have any
yeah, not to belabor this question too much, but yeah, I think since I taught a lot of scientists who come into the art studio, and I've seen a lot of artists that get their PhD or master's in science, I did notice that the scientists maybe had a harder time adjusting that mindset or getting out of that structure, but it's not necessarily bad because they had a lot of growth that came with that. And I would say where the artists struggled is they would have out of the box ideas. They would question philosophies or concepts that in science are just like people take for granted, like this is true. And they're like, but why, And they struggled because they kind of felt like they were on an island out here. Like, how come no one can understand me? And, so I think there's struggle in both ways, and knowing yourself maybe and having that information might help. But, yeah, okay.
And let's shift across, shall we, to the...
Sure.
Oh, just super briefly, someone asked, do you know of any projects related with science and music? And there's one really cool artist called Natalie Mirbach. I'm going to write that into the chat as well, so you've got the name. But she does really interesting work where she takes oceanographic data, so wave heights, wave frequency and force, and actually weaves them into baskets, which then become musical notations that she plays with groups of musicians. She's incredible. Also the Australian artist Nigel Hellier, who works with Antarctic scientists and undersea ice data. And he's got 2 projects, Under the Ice Cap is one, and bio_logging. I'm going to add those to the chat towards the end as well.
Great.
So,
the only thing I know, and I don't know that much, and I don't know their name, but I know people have looked into the sound of cells and the different vibrations of the different cells, and possible projects relating to that. So it's really endless possibilities. But yeah.
That's Guy Ben Airy, who does that work. He's really awesome too.
Thank you.
So it's very experimental music. I would probably call it more sound art, but yeah, there's definitely quite a bit out there. Have a look, whoever's asking that question, have a look at Leonardo and do a search for music and science, and you'll probably find some good stuff in there as well.
So we have another question, which is, what kind of practices, experiences, or methodologies do you think could improve the collaboration between scientists and artists? You had mentioned the capabilities mapping.
I think it depends on each individual pairing. It depends on how many people in the collaboration, as Joanna mentioned. And I think it's difficult to say broadly.
It
Do you
is.
have ideas for your particular pairing of scientific and artistic techniques?
One thing that I will share in my experience is not being afraid to say things that you might think are stupid or like out there. Like, even as a biologist, I don't know that much about soil science, or I don't know that much about molecular science and biology. And so I'll be like, can we just inject something into the cell? And it sounds really like, I'm like, oh my gosh, what are they going to think of me? But if you have the idea, just say it. Because I've also met people who are experts in their field, and it might be a very specific field, and they're talking kind of out of the box sometimes, and just like, what if we did this and saw what happened? And it sounds kind of like, I mean, it doesn't maybe sound sophisticated, or it just sounds like what's going on, but I wouldn't be afraid to just say what you're thinking, especially in the brainstorming part when you're first getting together. I think that was something I was a little hesitant, or I held back, but you never know who might take it, or it might spark another idea from one of your collaborators. So as you do it more, it gets easier, but yeah.
Being open, and I've also been thinking and looking at some of the international science art residencies that are around today, and at the different levels of support they give artists when they're initiating new collaborations. And I think there's something to be said. I've been developing this for myself, a list of questions that I want to ask of my collaborators. So I think it's just being really reflective on previous experiences, previous collaborative experiences, and making sure you kind of ask the questions you didn't ask the first time. Think of what could have gone better, and then go ahead and be shameless, be brave at asking those questions the next time. And ask them up front. Ask them when you first go to meet someone, when you're considering them for a collaboration. And I think, well, one more thing is picking the right collaboration, because oftentimes, you know, it's just like any creative relationship, it needs to be the right fit. So don't be afraid of going and talking to 10 different scientists. See how much time they're willing to give you. See if they're willing to listen to thoughts about philosophy. See if they're open to it. See if they're interested in it. It's like an interview. Don't just go with the first scientist just because they've offered you an amazing institution or incredible facilities. Like, that personal relationship is probably the most important part of the collaboration, aside from all the cool toys.
I 100% agree. And if you're not having trust within your collaborators, or it's a hard relationship, it can make it harder to be creative, and it can kind of add stress to your life, which is kind of the opposite of what wanting to open up and be creative and do collaborations is about. So thank you for mentioning that, because that's an important part.
Let's address this next one. What do you think are the common misconceptions of the interaction between science and art? Some people think that it's about making scientific images look beautiful.
For me, I see this all the time when I say that I do art science fusion or art science collaborations. They see it as, oh, you take pictures of the science you do and they're really pretty, and that's an outreach way. That's one way to disseminate what you're doing. Or it's like visual literacy and things like that. And like Andrea and I were saying, for us, it's a much deeper process and much more than that. Like I said, I've always struggled to, am I using one subject as a utility for another? And how do I really truly combine these two processes so that it adds value in my life? And so I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see people having in my field. But I do a lot of applied research, and so outreach is a big part. So they're kind of always thinking in those terms.
I think another misconception is that art and science are entirely different disciplines. Like, to come back to my own example of looking at microscopy, microcinematography, and cinematography, those are really, yes, they kind of belong to different disciplines, but they're really connected. So sometimes I have had the experience where I felt I'm going back and forth between two different areas, but often I'm not. I feel like I'm carving out this little area of optics, which is maybe just mine because there aren't that many people doing it at the moment. But yeah, I think you have to remember that art and science are abstract sort of ways of collecting practices. And there are a trillion different ways that we can connect these things so that they feel like holistic practices.
I agree. I think that's great. I think that's really very true. And I think Andrea mentioned something too, which is maybe there's not, art science is this new evolving field, but it's really an opportunity for anyone who's interested to carve their own career and what they want it to look like and what they want their career, how they want that to add value to their life. And even though I might have this faculty position in a science department, you can hook up with other departments within the university and make it your own. You could create a different program there. I mean, there's, like Andrea said, a million different ways to put these things together. So don't feel too limited. And I would say pursue whatever interests you, just for intrinsic value.
And Maria asks, what future projects do you have that involve science and art?
Do you want to go first, Andrea?
Oh, I've got two at the moment that I'm developing. One is to work in a biological laboratory for artists to look at the way that nanoparticle technologies respond to magnetism inside cells. So I'm going to use that as an opportunity to develop projects that are media art projects. So that will be participatory projects for the public. So I'd like to run them at large sort of media arts festivals. And the works I'm interested in developing, I want to look at the social and cultural implications of these nanobiosensing technologies. So these are technologies that are going to create so much more data for us in terms of what's circulating in our bodies at any one moment. They're going to create a lot more personal data that could be around hormones, different medications, things like that. That information could be uploaded to the internet. So there are a lot of ethical implications around all of this technology that I'm interested in making media artworks that provocatively interrogate what those changes are going to be. What are they going to look like? What are the most dystopic, kind of playful, speculative works that I could make to get people to think about and debate these technologies amongst themselves.
I love that. Thank you. So for the sake of time, I might go on to the next question, if you don't mind. That is, if I'm interested in doing an art science project, where should I start?
Good question.
That is a very good question. So I think it depends on personal preference. Where do you want to start? Do you want to develop an idea and then find collaborators, or do you want to find collaborators with an underdeveloped idea and see where it takes you? Do you know how you want to approach it, or do you want to learn how you want to approach it once you gather collaborators? And once you have collaborators, even your idea might change of how you thought you might approach it. I think the biggest thing is to just start. Just, planning, you can do some, but for me, sometimes I just start, and it's okay to go to people with an underdeveloped idea. I think sometimes we don't think it is, we have to have it all figured out, but just let them know, like, this is why I want to collaborate, is to generate ideas together.
I agree. And I think I would sort of probably recommend trusting your intuition as well, like reading in the mainstream media about different scientific processes, like in science magazines. Try and get a sense of what's happening out there. What do these projects make you feel? What do these technologies, there might be one that screams to you, oh, there's something not right about that. And maybe then think about how you could use your creative tools and techniques to interrogate that and to communicate it and to just create experiences and profound artworks that really help to question and critique the science. I think we're at a point in the world where artistic critique of science is really important. We have really complex technologies that are being rolled out and released into society before they're really undergoing a lot of regulatory processing governmentally. And so I think we have a responsibility to society to be the ones who are asking these questions and not just blindly accept the technologies that are being given to us. So I think use your intuition. If there's science that really excites you, then that's probably a good thing to start researching and seeing if you can find some collaborators in that field to further investigate with.
Yeah. Okay. I think there's another question. Do you think science and art should be taught in a different way in order to promote collaboration between disciplines? Do you recommend any education programs? This is a big topic of discussion in my university right now, especially given the pandemic and everything going online. And I would have to say, yeah, I think the traditional classroom of lecturer and listener and you just being a sponge is changing, and interaction and experience and like flipped classrooms where students teach other students, and I've been a part of that. And when they're given the freedom to pick a topic within a larger topic like global warming, and they can pick anything they want and teach it, they are invested, they are happy to do the work, they do an amazing job, and because they're closer in age with their peers that they're teaching, they can almost explain it in a more clear way than I would say maybe a faculty member or superior. So I really do enjoy alternative ways of education, and I think it's slowly moving in that direction, I hope.
Yeah, I don't know any education. I mean, there is a Masters of Biological Art at Symbiotica in Australia. There are a few more in Europe that are sort of science art, mostly master's programs. I think promoting collaboration is a process of enabling people and getting them to understand their own power in terms of, and their own ability to contribute to collaborations between science and art. But I'm not quite sure which level that should start at. I think that it's really great to have education in two areas. I mean, maybe there should be some more leniency within undergraduate degrees to integrate science and art rather than doing a double degree. Yeah.
One way too is you can, like Andrea said, I think it can be hard to find those programs already out there, but finding ways to create those for yourself, those opportunities. So if you're talking about if you want to do a grad program or even undergrad, sometimes there's opportunities to create your own major. And also talking to your principal investigator who you'd be working under and saying, this is my idea. Can I have a co-PI with someone in the art department? And things like that might be an opportunity these days. So,
great.
Yeah.
It's 7 o'clock. Shall we?
Oh, perfect.
Finishing Anna Karen?
Hey, Rogelio, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much for Joanna, Andrea, for your time. I enjoy a lot listening to your conversation, and we had several questions. Is there any final comment that you may want to make before saying goodbye? Or
I just want to say thanks for having us. Thanks for having me. We've really enjoyed this, and follow your passions. Opportunities will open for you. So.
Agreed. Yes, thank you so much to Clubes de Ciencia for having us. It's been great to chat with you again, Joanna.
You too, Andrea.
Love to everyone.
Okay.
Bueno, gracias a todos por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Recuerden que todos los miércoles y viernes tenemos estas sesiones, entonces los esperamos y consulten el calendario que tenemos en nuestras redes sociales, en Instagram, en Facebook, y bueno, nos vemos en la próxima. Hasta luego, gracias a todos.
Hasta luego.